She stood alone in court, just 17, about to be sentenced by a judge who saw her as nothing but trouble. But then she rose, looked the judge dead in the eye, and said, "I object, on the grounds of procedural misconduct." The room froze. What happened next stunned everyone. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, just another name, another file, another teen shuffled through the courtroom machinery. Judge Meredith Crowley had seen hundreds like Kayla Brooks before. To her, the 17-year-old was just another problem kid from a poor neighborhood who thought she knew better than the system. Another mouthy protester trying to make noise where silence was expected. Crowley didn't see potential. She saw disruption. The courtroom, though only half full, felt oppressive. The air stale and heavy with indifference. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a cold glow on the polished wood of the judge's bench. At the defense table, Kayla sat alone, her court-appointed attorney absent. The case had been rescheduled twice already, but Crowley had insisted it would be handled with or without representation. A message, perhaps. Justice waits for no one, especially not for a girl like Kayla. She wore her school uniform, a faded white blouse and navy skirt, slightly wrinkled, with a thrifted blazer pulled tight across her shoulders. Her braids were neatly tied back, but her eyes were anything but subdued. They flicked around the courtroom, assessing everything: the judge, the bailiff, the quiet murmur of clerks, and the sneering glance from the prosecuting attorney. A soft whisper came from the gallery. A teacher, maybe, or a local activist who had come to observe. But no one stood beside her. No one argued her case. Case number 8743, the State of Georgia versus Kayla Brooks, the bailiff announced. Crowley adjusted her glasses. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her tone sharp and without warmth, "you are charged with contempt of court, disruption of public order, and resisting lawful authority during a public protest. Do you have anything to say for yourself before I hand down my ruling?" Kayla opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, the room held its breath. "I was exercising my First Amendment rights," she finally said, voice steady, though soft. Crowley smirked. "Your rights end where order begins. And frankly, I'm tired of young people like you thinking rebellion is some kind of virtue. Actions have consequences. You need to learn that, the hard way." She turned to her clerk. "Prepare transfer documents, detention until further notice." Gasps rippled from the back of the courtroom. Kayla blinked. Her mouth parted, but she didn't speak. Her attorney still hadn't arrived. The prosecutor leaned in, whispering something inaudible to the judge. She nodded. "Bail is denied," Crowley said. "This court doesn't tolerate anarchists." Kayla gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles whitened. In the gallery, one woman stood, tall, maybe in her 30s, and raised her hand. "Your Honor, if I may—" Crowley slammed her gavel. "You may not. This is not a community forum. Sit down, or leave." The woman obeyed, but her eyes didn't move from Kayla, and then came the sentence that shifted the atmosphere from cold silence to quiet rage. "You want to fight the system?" Crowley said. "Let's see how loud you are after a month in juvenile detention." The words echoed. They didn't just carry authority. They dripped with condescension. As if this wasn't a legal proceeding, but a warning. A punishment not for a crime, but for daring to speak up. Kayla didn't cry. She didn't flinch. But the damage was done. Not just to her case, but to the idea that justice in that room was ever meant for her in the first place. From the far corner, a court clerk whispered to the other, "This feels off." The bailiff moved toward Kayla with handcuffs. She stood without resistance, holding her head high. In that moment, she wasn't just a defendant. She was every kid who got silenced in the principal's office, every black teen called aggressive for speaking their mind, every protester dismissed as a threat instead of a citizen. Her silence screamed louder than anything she could have said. And still, the judge didn't blink. Crowley turned away, reaching for the next file. Bring in the next case. But what none of them knew, not the bailiff, not the clerk, not even Crowley herself, was that Kayla had spent the last 4 years doing something most teens didn't. Late at night, while others scrolled through TikTok or binge-watched shows, she read law textbooks, case files, Supreme Court opinions. She studied civil rights cases, memorized procedural rules, annotated her own copy of the Constitution. Not for school, not for clout, for moments like this. But she hadn't planned to speak. Not yet. Not without a lawyer, not without backup. Yet something in that sentence, "Let's see how loud you are," ignited her. The room would soon learn that this girl wasn't the story of another life ruined by injustice. She was about to become something far more dangerous. A challenge to the system. A reminder that knowledge, even from a teenager, can burn through centuries of arrogance. And the next words she would say would leave the courtroom stunned. The holding cell was cold, not just from the lack of heat, but from something deeper. The absence of dignity. The concrete bench pressed hard against Kayla's back, and the buzzing of the flickering light overhead never stopped. It was 3 a.m. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. She wrapped her arms around herself, not because she was cold. She was. But because there was no one else to do it for her. No family here. No lawyer. Just echoes of footsteps in the hallway and the low hum of guards who never looked you in the eyes. Across from her, 2 other girls slept against the wall. One snored softly. The other stared into the dark, blinking slowly, as if trying to disappear. No one talked. Kayla had always been good at being silent. In school, it was safer that way. Teachers didn't like when she corrected them, especially not with citations. At home, silence helped her mother sleep between night shifts. And on the streets, silence kept her from being noticed by the wrong kind of people. But this silence, this one, it cut deeper. She thought of her mom, April Brooks, a nurse who worked 12-hour shifts at Grady Hospital, sometimes 16. Kayla could almost hear her voice. "Keep your head down, baby. They don't fight fair out there." But Kayla had fought anyway. Not with fists, with facts, with questions, with protest signs and petitions and meetings in cramped community centers where old folks called her firecracker and told her she was brave. And now she was here, locked up, alone, because she'd refused to sit quietly while her classmate, Jamal, was tackled by police at a peaceful protest, because she'd raised her voice when the school board slashed funding for the only Black history program in the district, because she'd said no to a system that said yes only to obedience. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the wave rising in her chest. It wasn't the cold that hurt most. It was the betrayal. All those promises. Speak up. Be a leader. Use your voice. No one tells you what happens when that voice threatens someone in power. No one tells you how fast they try to shut you down. Where was her lawyer? She replayed the hearing in her head. Every word. Every look. Judge Crowley never once asked if she understood the charges. Never confirmed whether her court-appointed attorney had even met with her. He hadn't. Never allowed Kayla to explain her side of the story. Just guilt, gavel, detention. That's not justice, Kayla thought. That's punishment for existing. The pain settled in her ribs, dull but constant. Not physical, but heavy. A kind of weight she'd carried before, but never like this. Not this naked. Not this exposed. The fluorescent light buzzed louder, or maybe she just noticed it more now. Her stomach growled. She hadn't been given dinner. She was too late in processing, the guard had said. "You'll eat tomorrow." Tomorrow, as if she was just another piece of paperwork to be filed and forgotten. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. A guard passed by without looking. Kayla lifted her head, almost hopeful, but the keys jingled further down. Not for her. She looked around the cell again. The girls still hadn't moved. This was normal to them. God, Kayla thought. Is this going to become normal for me too? The thought chilled her more than the air. Suddenly, a wave of memory hit her. Not a flashback, but a flood. She was 9, sitting in the back of a courtroom while her brother Malik, 15 at the time, was sentenced to probation for possession of stolen property. It was a calculator he found on the ground. The white cop said he looked suspicious. Malik cried on the walk home, not because of the sentence, but because the judge had called him unruly, because their mother had missed work just to hear that word said in front of strangers. Kayla remembered gripping her mother's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. That was the day she decided to learn the law. Not for a grade, not for a diploma. For revenge. Not violent revenge. Not the kind the system expected from kids who looked like her. But the kind that dismantled systems from within. The kind that knew every rule, every loophole, every word of legal code, and used it like a scalpel. But in this moment, sitting here, she didn't feel like a prodigy. She felt like a number, a mistake, a cautionary tale. The door buzzed suddenly. A guard stepped in. "Lights out." Kayla didn't move. The guard flipped the switch. Darkness swallowed the room. Still, she stayed sitting, staring into the black. And then, quietly, like a secret she was telling only to herself, she whispered, "They don't know what I know." A small fire flickered inside her. Weak, but stubborn. She wouldn't let this be the end. Not after everything. Not after Malik. Not after all the nights reading case law by the light of her phone, hiding the books under her bed, arguing with imaginary prosecutors in the mirror. She was bruised, but not broken. And tomorrow, if no one came for her, she'd stand alone again. But this time, she wouldn't just defend herself. She'd destroy the lie they called justice. The courtroom was colder than she remembered. Maybe it was the early hour, or maybe it was the weight of silence pressing against the walls like a fifth defendant. Kayla stood in the same spot where she'd been sentenced less than 24 hours earlier. But something had shifted. Not in the room, not in the system, but in her. Her attorney still hadn't shown. It was 9:12 a.m. She had been pulled out of her cell at 7:45, shackled, and transported back into the courtroom like a delivery. No explanation, no warning. She was told it was a procedural reassessment. Whatever that meant. She stood alone at the defense table. This time, no one had even bothered to pretend they were defending her. Judge Meredith Crowley entered, her heels clacking on the tile like punctuation. She adjusted her robe, her glasses, her posture, everything except her attitude. "Let the record show that Ms. Kayla Brooks is appearing without representation," Crowley said curtly. "The court will proceed regardless." Kayla's heart pounded in her chest like a war drum. Every rational part of her screamed to stay quiet, stay small, don't provoke her. But then the judge said it again, this time with a little smirk. "Without representation, the court will move to finalize sentencing." And that was it. That was the moment. Something snapped, not in fear, in clarity. Kayla took a step forward. Her voice, when it came, was calm, clear, and unmistakably deliberate. I object, Your Honor. Crowley blinked. Silence. Then laughter. Dry and cold. You object? The judge repeated, as if tasting something sour. On what grounds? Kayla didn't hesitate. On the grounds of procedural misconduct and denial of my Sixth Amendment right to effective counsel. My court-appointed attorney has not met with me once, and I've received no access to adequate defense preparation. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Crowley narrowed her eyes. Ms. Brooks, you are not qualified to argue motions in this court. You are not an attorney. No, Kayla said, but I know the law. And with that, she pulled from her satchel a thick binder, battered, covered in duct tape, bulging with handwritten notes, color-coded tabs, printed case law, and worn pages from textbooks decades old. She placed it gently on the table, opened it to a marked page, and began to read. In Gideon v. Wainwright, 372 U.S. 335, the Supreme Court ruled that the Sixth Amendment guarantees a right to counsel for criminal defendants in state courts. This ruling is the foundation of public defense in America. Denying that right invalidates any sentence handed down without legal support. Kayla's hands trembled slightly as she flipped to another tab. In Strickland v. Washington, 466 U.S. 668, the court established the two-prong test for ineffective assistance of counsel. I argue that both prongs are met. My counsel failed to perform with reasonable competence, and this failure prejudiced the outcome of the trial. Crowley was motionless now. The room had changed. The girl they'd expected to fold had unfolded a map of the very terrain they thought only they could navigate. You've been studying case law? The judge asked, a note of disbelief slipping through her professional detachment. For 4 years, Kayla said, because people like me don't get second chances. We don't get mercy. We get silence, unless we speak their language. From the back of the room, someone stood. A man in a gray suit, late 50s, salt and pepper beard, leaned over the bar, separating audience from counsel. Your Honor, if I may, he said. Crowley turned. And you are? Professor Thomas McAdams. Emory Law. I've been observing this hearing. I'd like to offer a statement. Crowley hesitated, then gave a short nod. Proceed. McAdams cleared his throat. In 30 years of legal education, I've rarely seen a student, let alone a minor, with such command of constitutional law and procedural precedent. This young woman is demonstrating not just understanding, but application. If this court proceeds to sentence her without regard to her right to counsel, it is doing so in direct violation of federal precedent, and, I might add, under the observation of several legal scholars now paying very close attention to this case. There it was, the shift, the tipping point. Crowley's hand moved slightly, not toward the gavel, but toward her own binder. She glanced at the clerk, then at the prosecutor, who now looked uncomfortable, flipping through notes he hadn't expected to use. Kayla didn't relax, not yet, because she knew how power worked. It didn't crumble. It recoiled. It doubled down, or it waited. But it never just surrendered. Crowley straightened her spine. Miss Brooks, this court will take a brief recess to review the claims presented. She stood and left the bench without another word. The moment she disappeared behind the chamber doors, the room exhaled. People turned to Kayla, not with pity this time, but with something closer to respect. The woman from the gallery, the one who'd tried to speak yesterday, gave her a small nod. Kayla sat down slowly, her breath finally catching up with her. She had just stopped a sentence. Alone, with nothing but her words, her binder, her mind, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of hope. The courtroom doors opened again after 15 long minutes. But when Judge Crowley returned, something about her had changed. Her posture was stiffer, her gaze more calculated. She adjusted her robe a bit too precisely, like someone forcing control back into their grip. Kayla stood before she was asked to. Her binder rested open in front of her, pages filled with color-coded notes and legal precedents that had already shaken the foundations of the room once today. Crowley cleared her throat. "This court has reviewed the objection raised by Ms. Brooks." She paused, eyes scanning the room. "Although this court finds her approach unconventional, the legal basis cited does require further scrutiny." A beat. "But let me be clear," she added sharply. "This is not a forum for self-aggrandizement or courtroom theatrics." Kayla didn't respond. She knew better. Let Crowley talk. Let her try to reassert dominance. It wouldn't last, because knowledge was a different kind of power, and Kayla had enough of it to make the floor beneath Crowley's feet shift, slowly, then suddenly. The judge turned to the prosecution. "Counselor, do you have a response?" The man, Assistant DA Richard Lansing, looked like he'd just swallowed glass. He stood, straightened his tie, and spoke cautiously. "Your Honor, while the defendant has shown unusual familiarity with legal precedent, we contend that her objection, though eloquent, does not negate the original charges. And yet you were prepared to proceed to sentencing without confirming her legal representation?" McAdams interrupted from the back. Crowley glared. "Mr. McAdams, you are not—" "With respect," he said. "You allowed my testimony earlier. You can allow one more sentence." Crowley hesitated. McAdams nodded toward Kayla. "This isn't about eloquence. This is about legality. About rights denied. You don't have to like how she speaks. You only have to recognize that she's right." A few murmurs rippled through the gallery again. Lansing sat back down. Crowley shifted, visibly irritated. "Ms. Brooks, are you formally requesting a hearing to review your prior sentencing?" Kayla nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And I would also like to file a motion to dismiss based on violation of constitutional rights and ineffective assistance of counsel." Crowley exhaled slowly. "Motion. Noted." Then came the silence, the kind that usually follows an explosion. Because in that moment, everyone knew. Kayla wasn't fighting to avoid punishment. She was fighting to dismantle the very logic behind her arrest. And she was winning. "Very well," Crowley said after a long pause. "Present your argument." Kayla stepped forward. Her voice, now steady, filled the courtroom. She began with Tinker vs. Des Moines, highlighting student speech protections. Then she moved to in regat, establishing due process rights for juveniles. She cited Ferretta v. California, which affirmed a defendant's right to self-representation. She didn't speak with passion, not the kind judges like to dismiss as emotional. She spoke with precision. Every word hit like a scalpel. Crowley leaned back, arms crossed. Kayla flipped to a new section. "And finally, Your Honor, I'd like to call attention to the unequal application of charges regarding protests in this jurisdiction." The judge raised an eyebrow. "I've reviewed 78 recent cases involving minors arrested during public demonstrations. In all white suburban school districts, charges were dismissed within 72 hours. In inner-city schools, overwhelmingly Black and Latino, cases were prosecuted 84% of the time." McAdams raised his brows. The room stilled. "That is not only unjust," Kayla continued. "It's unconstitutional. Equal protection under the law means something, or it means nothing at all." Crowley didn't answer. She couldn't. Kayla's voice had built a wall of facts so solid, there was nothing to lean on. "Do you believe I should be punished for using my voice?" Kayla asked, meeting her eyes. "Or just because I used it in a way you didn't like?" Crowley opened her mouth, then closed it. She wasn't just losing control. She was losing the illusion of moral authority. And everyone saw it. After another long silence, the judge looked to the clerk. "Prepare the paperwork to vacate the prior sentencing and release Ms. Brooks on her own recognizance." She said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. "But—" Lansing began to protest. Crowley raised a hand. "That's enough, counselor." The words were dry, hollow, like a bell that no longer rings with pride. Kayla didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just nodded once, because this wasn't a win for applause. It was a win for survival. As the bailiff stepped forward to remove her shackles, Kayla didn't flinch. She didn't thank the court. She didn't bow. She just picked up her binder, held it close, and walked out of the courtroom without permission. Behind her, people rose. Some clapped softly. Others simply watched, unsure if they'd just witnessed a moment or a movement. McAdams followed her out. So did the woman from the gallery, now holding out a business card, eyes wide with respect. And Crowley? She stayed behind, sitting alone on the bench, surrounded by silence and a faint, uncomfortable realization. She hadn't been defeated by rebellion. She'd been dismantled by the very law she claimed to uphold. The sunlight hit differently that day. Kayla stepped out of the courthouse and into a different world. Or maybe more truthfully, the world stepped into her. The sky was the same dull Atlanta gray, the streets still cluttered with early traffic, horns and sirens and overheard fragments of Monday. But to the people who saw her, truly saw her, something had shifted. She was no longer that girl from juvie. She was Kayla Brooks, the teen who shut down a courtroom with nothing but a binder and her voice. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, not planned, not orchestrated, just people. Word had spread fast. A law professor's tweet, a short viral video someone had recorded inside the courtroom. The caption, "17-year-old defends herself in court and wins." Within the hour, local news vans pulled up, cameras pointed, microphones extended. Journalists shouted her name. "Kayla, how did you learn all this? Were you scared standing up to a judge? Do you plan to go into law?" Kayla didn't answer at first. She looked at the crowd, teachers, students, activists, even strangers, and then slowly stepped up to the courthouse steps. The same stairs she'd walked in shackled just hours earlier. She turned, faced the crowd, and spoke without notes. "I didn't do this for a headline. I did this because I had no other choice. Because I've seen what happens when we stay quiet. My brother was silenced. My classmates were silenced. I've been told my whole life to sit down, keep it cute, stay safe." She took a breath. Her voice didn't shake. "But safety isn't justice. Silence isn't protection. Knowing your rights shouldn't feel like rebellion." Someone in the crowd started clapping, then another. Then it spread, slow, then thunderous. Kayla stepped back. She wasn't used to applause. Her kind usually didn't get it. Later that evening, she sat in her tiny bedroom, her back pressed against the wall, phone buzzing nonstop. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted but proud. They'd eaten microwave pizza and half-watched the news as the anchor said her name 3 times in one segment. Every time they did, her mom teared up a little more. "Guess all those nights reading instead of sleeping paid off," she said, rubbing her daughter's shoulder. "You didn't just defend yourself, Kayla. You proved something bigger." Kayla nodded but said nothing. The adrenaline had worn off. In its place, a quiet weight, not fear, responsibility, because this wasn't over. The messages on her phone kept piling in. Law professors, civil rights attorneys, student groups. One offered her a summer internship. Another offered to sponsor her college applications. Then came the email that made her sit up straight. Congresswoman Alina Vance would like to speak with you. She blinked, read it again. The world was listening, but for Kayla, the real victory hadn't been winning in court. It was being heard. In the following weeks, her story spread across the country. What had started as a short legal moment became something far larger, a symbol of what youth, knowledge, and courage could accomplish when institutions failed. High schools started using her hearing transcript in civics class. Local college students made Kayla's law binder memes. A group of young girls in Chicago started a club called the Brooks Brief, where they met weekly to study case law. Kayla didn't ask for any of it. She still woke up early, made her own lunch, helped her mom with laundry. She wasn't chasing fame. She was building something deeper. Legacy. One afternoon, she visited the youth center where she used to volunteer, the same place where she'd been introduced to her first copy of the Constitution, the tiny, tattered booklet someone had tossed into the free box like junk. When she walked in, a group of middle schoolers gasped. One girl whispered, "That's her." Another asked, "Can we take a picture with you?" Kayla laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days, and nodded. "Only if you promise to read the 14th Amendment." They all groaned, but she saw the spark in their eyes, and in that moment, she understood. She wasn't just the girl who won her own case. She was the beginning of something. The invitation to speak came 3 weeks later. A legal reform conference was happening downtown. Kayla wasn't on the list at first. They'd invited mostly academics and policymakers, but after enough public pressure, her name was added. Keynote slot. 17 years old, no degree, just truth. She walked up to the stage wearing the same blazer she'd worn in court. She didn't try to look polished. She didn't want to blend in. She wanted them to remember who she was when they ignored her. She stood at the podium and looked out at a sea of suits. And she told them everything. How the system was designed to bury people like her. How legal jargon was a weapon used to disempower those without access. How silence was taught as survival, but how that silence could be shattered with knowledge. "My name is Kayla Brooks," she said, voice rising. "And I didn't win because I'm a genius. I won because I was desperate enough to learn what no one would teach me, and because I believed that even if no one else would defend me, I could still defend myself." A pause. "You don't need to be born into power to understand how it works. You just have to stop being afraid of it." Silence. Then thunderous applause. Not polite, not obligatory. Real. Standing ovation. Later, someone told her that the judge who once sentenced her had been watching the live stream, forced into early retirement after ethics complaints were filed by observers, including Professor McAdams. But Kayla didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The law had finally spoken, through her, and the world had listened. The room was quiet, not with fear, but with reverence. Hundreds of faces filled the university auditorium, students, professors, community leaders, and policymakers. The banner above the stage read, "Reimagining Justice, Youth and the Law." Kayla Brooks stood behind the podium, not in a suit or polished power dress, but in jeans and a t-shirt that read, "Know Your Rights" in bold, hand-stitched letters. She didn't need a costume to look powerful anymore. She was power. Her eyes scanned the audience. Some leaned forward. Others held notebooks in their laps, ready to capture every word. But Kayla wasn't here to impress them. She was here to free them, from fear, from ignorance, from silence. "This," she began, her voice calm but resonant, "is the part of the story no one tells you." A pause. The part after the courtroom, after the news cameras leave, after the applause fades. This is the part where you have to live with what you've started. She walked slowly across the stage, cordless mic in hand, not performing, sharing. For weeks after my case, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the girls still in juvie, the ones who didn't have a binder, or a professor watching, or a courtroom full of strangers who suddenly decided to care. She stopped walking. The silence deepened. I wasn't a miracle. I was an exception. Then she smiled, just a little. But that's the thing about exceptions. They make people ask questions. And questions? They break systems wide open. The audience was still hypnotized. Kayla's speech didn't try to glorify her past. She spoke of her fear, her rage, the nights she cried into her pillow, the guilt of walking free while others stayed locked up. She spoke of how many times she almost stayed silent, how many times she doubted she had the right to speak at all. And yet, she said softly, here I am. She took a breath and looked straight into the camera, the live stream beaming her image across the country. Because somewhere out there, there's another girl, just like me, sitting in a courtroom, alone, and she thinks she has no power. Kayla's voice trembled, but only for a second. She's wrong. Kayla lowered the mic and returned to center stage. A moderator stepped forward, inviting her to the Q&A session, but no one raised their hand at first. They were still processing, still breathing her words, still feeling them. Eventually, a student stood, nervous, maybe 19, with a law textbook clutched to her chest. How did you know? You were allowed to speak. That it would matter? Kayla looked at her, no hesitation. I didn't. She let that land. I just decided that silence was worse than failure. Later that evening, as the sun dipped over the city skyline, Kayla sat in a quiet garden on campus, a place she'd found accidentally after her speech. She needed the silence, not the kind that oppresses, but the kind that heals. Her phone buzzed. Another interview request, another panel, another invitation to speak. She set it aside. For the first time in weeks, she felt still, not empty, not numb, just still. The wind brushed through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. She closed her eyes and saw her younger self, 9 years old, in the back of that courtroom, watching her brother get labeled a criminal. She saw the girl sitting in her room late at night with law books and highlighters, while the world told her, none of this will matter. She saw the version of herself in that holding cell, scared, angry, exhausted, whispering, they don't know what I know. That whisper had become a roar, and that roar had changed something, not just in her, but in them. Meanwhile, in a quiet office miles away, Judge Meredith Crowley sat at her desk, a desk she would be clearing out in 3 days. Early retirement, they called it. Ethical concerns, they whispered. The walls were bare now, the plaques removed, the air stale. She clicked on the university live stream out of habit. There was Kayla, clear, poised, in total command. Crowley didn't know what she felt. Shame? Resentment? Maybe something deeper. Regret? She watched as the crowd rose in applause, and for the first time in a long time she didn't reach for her gavel. She just listened. Weeks later, a mural appeared on the side of a building in downtown Atlanta. It showed Kayla, binder in hand, eyes steady, mouth slightly open as if mid-argument. Around her, words spiraled like armor. Justice, voice, resistance, law, courage. Someone had written in sharp red paint below it, not a victim, a revolution. Kayla walked past it one day, alone. She didn't take a selfie. She didn't post it. She just stood there, watching, and smiled, because she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning.